Thank you. First of all, how great is this conference? Matt? Yeah. Especially. They keep getting better. Let's hope that trend doesn't go woefully south. When Matt brought this up a couple years ago, I remember thinking, yeah, sure, you just won a conference in Vancouver, because you have 15 children. You can't travel anywhere. But he was serious about it, and he did it. This is awesome. So I apologize. I'm a little under the weather, chewing on a cough drop right now just so I don't have any episodes. But here I want to talk about virtual machines and automation, which is something I am actually excited about. But before I start, the things I'm not going to cover are ESX, vSphere, or net booting VMs. But there's tons of information online for all of this stuff. I would encourage you to read Rich Troughton's Dare Flounder blog, which is an exhaustive information repo. You could lose hours on that thing. I have. And also, Virtually Ghetto has a whole Apple site. I'm going to get rid of this thing. And hopefully I won't cough. A whole Apple site dedicated to vSphere, ESX, and whatnot. And a lot of interesting interviews with companies who are doing work in that space. So I recommend you check that out. Some ground rules. Everything I do is on 10.10.3, Fusion 7.1.1, Vagrant, and Packer at the close to the most recent releases. And since I'm being thorough here, we're in Vancouver. That's the moon phase. And like I said, I've been laying in bed all week, drowning in my own sweat. So this means your mileage may vary. So what is automation? Who here has a handy definition for automation? Anyone? Come on, we're all friends.
Computers do the work.
Alistair? What?
Computers do the work.
That's a good one. Anyone? Have you ever heard people say that it's a great way to allow you to kind of abstract away the menial tasks so you can work on the interesting edge cases or documentation, God forbid. Or it allows you to have verifiable, repeatable steps. I like to say it makes me lazy, or allows me to be lazy. All of these things are true. However you justify fitting it into your workflow, I think it's a good thing, as long as we all agree that automation is good. So what types of things can be done in Fusion? Well, interestingly enough, they provide us with a library of ideas. And I mean this literally. There's a library folder inside the VMware Fusion application bundle that has a bunch of scripts and whatnot. Excuse me. For instance, I'm sure we're all very familiar with the deploy VMware Fusion deployment package inside the bundle. Does anybody here use this to deploy Fusion out to their systems? We can grab it and look inside that bundle itself, and there is an INI file that you can put your volume license in, and you can also stick the VMware Fusion application inside this bundle, kind of Inception style. And then you end up, once you put your license key in, you end up with a package that you can deploy to your users. Very handy for pushing out through Monkey or Casper, however you guys are doing that. Has anybody ever had a third-party reseller tell them that VMware does not do volume licenses? No? I'm still trying to figure out how to respond to that email. Another script you might be familiar with is the initialization tool. If you run this as root, you can invoke it as perhaps a post-install script. It will activate Fusion on the local system. Is that looking okay? Yeah, it looks crazy blurry. It'll allow users to load VMware Fusion without first having to type in the admin password. So useful for those environments. Should we try to fix this? See, if we put all these brains together, look at what you can figure out. That part's my fault. All right, moving on. What other things can be found inside the library folder? There's a couple of really cool items in there. One's called VMware Raw Disk Creator. One is called VMware Disk Manager, but I'll get to those in a little bit. What I want to look at first is probably the most useful, which is VMrun. VMrun is a binary that they provide that you can interact with your VMX files via command line. If you invoke it without any arguments, it gives you a whole ledger of possibilities. At the very top, you see what they call power commands, which I kind of like. These are commands that you can use to start, stop, reset, suspend, pause, etc. And as you can see, all you need to do is pass the path to your VMX file. If you don't know what that path is, if you run VMrun list, it'll show you a list of VMX files that are currently loaded by the system. In this example, I have 3 VMs running. You can see I updated these slides since last week. Once you get the path to the VMX file, you can run VMrun stop, and it will shut down the VM and provide you feedback that it is doing so. And vice versa, you can tell it to start, and it'll load back up. An interesting thing to note is if you run it with the no GUI argument, it'll load the VM headless. And that comes in handy in many scenarios. Excuse me. So in this example, VMrun list showed the VMX file that is running. But if you're logged into the machine in the GUI, you're not going to see it loaded in the VMware Fusion interface. VMware Fusion doesn't even need to be running at all. So you could have these VMs running when the Mac is at the login screen, for instance. Some other things you can do with VMrun, you can get the guest IP address. Useful if you're using a NATed environment and it keeps ticking up IPs as you're doing your testing. You can check whether VMware tools are installed with the check tool state argument. Run script and guest is great, but I haven't been able to use that successfully in 10.10.3. Kind of hoping that will come back. Because there's a lot of use cases for this. You can push a script, run it, or you can gather data from a VM, copy it to a temp file, that sort of thing. And as for an example, our friend, my friend and yours, Per Olofsson, has a gist that he posted where he checks for OS X software updates. And what this does is it clones a VM, loads it, runs a script using that run script and guest to run software update, gathers the information, posts it back so he can gather that up. But like I said, I haven't been able to get this to work in 10.10.3. So building VMs, VMware provides a way to do it using the OS X installer. They have documentation on this. It's very easy. You can just drag the installer onto VMware Fusion, go through the setup assistant and everything. It's not very much fun. Rich, again, has a create VMware OS X install DMG project that he uses to create a bootable installer that then you can use as a startup volume for an empty VM that will run through the startup process and install extra packages that you add in there, slipstream style. Excuse me. And he also has documentation on booting VMs to Deploy Studio to deploy VMs in that manner as well. But we're all Mac admins here. We all have a way of creating images. I think we all agree that AutoDMG is the primo way of doing this. Again, a project from Per Olufsen. And this got me to thinking, myself and a colleague at Omni Group named Gilbert Wilson, about how to utilize a DMG output from AutoDMG and get that into VMware Fusion in the quickest way possible. And with that in mind, I came up with a project on GitHub called vfuse. It will take a DMG output from AutoDMG or any image creation utility that you use, and then it spits out a working VMware Fusion system. This was part of my quest to learn Python and to get, to move from horrible to moderately terrible in Python. So I encourage you to read through the code and laugh at my expense if you choose to. But the need was to do rapid testing. So even NetBoot was kind of too goofy for some of the stuff that we were doing. vfuse takes a few arguments, but the only one that's required is the input. You just say -i, the directory path to my DMG, and it'll create a generically named VMware VM bundle that Fusion will know how to launch. Other than that, you can customize it with an output directory, an output name, and you can do some other things around VSX and whatnot. In this example, what I'm doing is passing a DMG that was created with a tool similar to AutoDMG, and I'm saving it with a custom name of test OS X VMware VM, and running this process on a SSD-enabled Mac only takes about a minute or two. It's really, really fast. And remember earlier I mentioned those two interesting utilities inside the library folder in the Fusion bundle, Raw Disk Creator and vDisk Manager. Those are basically doing the heavy lifting in this vfuse business. The rest of it is just window dressing. So poke it apart, see what those scripts are running, and you can just run those manually or incorporate them into your own scripts in your own workflows. And you end up with a never booted VM, as Per Olufsen intended with his AutoDMG project. So one thing I added in is the use of templates formatted as JSON files. So all of those command line options that you can pass to vfuse, you can also declare in a JSON file to make the process reusable. You can throw it into, source control share files and whatnot. It's great if you're doing automation of VMs, or if you have a whole work group who you want to run the same VM to do some testing for you. You can just give them a template and they'll run it. Which brings me to a quick aside. One side effect that I didn't even think about, but I was happy to discover actually works, is if you give it a URL as the source, it will do the disk conversion over the network without first downloading the DMG. You can optionally check the or flip the cache value to true to cache that DMG locally. So if they kill their VM and they run against this template again, it won't go grab it over the network again. It'll just use what is local. It's not doing any checksum or anything, so it's just file name based at this point. A little companion script, and this was again born out of a nascent project at my previous job, where we wanted engineers to be able to test software against different versions of OS X, but we did not necessarily want engineers to be buying a whole bunch of machines for their office. So we wanted to provide them with a quick way to spin up VMs and be able to log in and do their testing. And we looked at ESX. It's very expensive. We were conscious of the EULA. It gets less expensive the less conscious of the EULA you are. So we decided to try to do it with Fusion. So started coming up with this vserv idea. I would consider it half-baked at this point. It works, but probably could use some efforts. But the idea is that it's just a little daemon that runs in the local user context, where it'll monitor a VMX file, and if the user shuts it down, or if the VM crashes for any reason, the machine restarts, the service will bring it back up. And optionally, you can tell it to kill the VM and get rid of it from the local catalog. We were kind of trying to roll out a VM as a service for our users. And with that, I'm going to show you how this works, if it works. So here's a template I have. You see I have the input to my DMG file, which was created with auto DMG. Oh, right. You have to do it like this, don't you? So you have the input to the DMG file. Output is empty because I just want it to save to the local, the same directory I'm in. Giving it a custom name there. I don't care about caching because it's not an HTTP. The hardware version is the little bit that Fusion wants to have in the VMX file, and they iterate that with every OS X release, it seems. So I expect that to increase to 12 at some point in the future. Memory, I'm going to leave it at 2. Disk type. Disk type, I believe, is you can change that to create a VM that is more appropriate for ESX, so then you can copy over to an ESX system and run it there. And then the Packer template is used for creating vagrant systems out of it, and I'll get into that in a second. So I'm going to run, what did I call it, MacDevOps? And I'm going to pass it the start, which will ideally tell the vserv business that I want it to start monitoring my VM, and I want it to actually start. So we'll see if that happens. Like I said, it takes about a minute or so. If anybody knows any good jokes, Jody?
Good jokes?
Yeah, you don't know any good ones, do you? Alistair, you have to know some jokes.
You said good jokes.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I believe we have a volunteer. No horse walks into a bar, why the long face, nothing. Anybody have any comments while we're waiting for this to happen? Yes, sir?
Can you specify a different account for the file?
Specify a different account?
No, location hard drive.
For it to save to?
Yeah, for the DMX, APK.
Yeah, you can tell it where you want it to save out to. Yeah. Yeah, in this case, I left it blank in the output, and that makes it assume that I really want it just to save it in the local directory that I'm in right now. Greg?
I tried this tool 6 months ago.
So sorry.
And I ran into a problem where the created VM had a limited amount of disk space. And,
Right.
And
Yeah.
we didn't discover that until, way later, and it was really hard to resize the disk afterwards.
I think it gets that from the output DMG from AutoDMG, which I think defaults to 30. Is that right?
Could be, or maybe in this small.
And that's a good point. I think when that came up previously with somebody on GitHub, I think in the meantime I just said, oh, I'll just change that value in the script because it pulls it in there somewhere. So that's
in the vfuse script.
yeah, I think it is, and that would be a great issue to open up on GitHub. So it's done. Created the VM in my local directory, which you can see is right there, the OS10 MacDevOpsYVR. And we'll see if the vserve business will pick it up. If not, I will move on. Any other questions?
Yeah. What is in the Packer template, Jason? I'm just not familiar with where Packer interacts.
I'll get right there, yeah. Once again, Alistair is way ahead of all of us. All right. We're going to assume that that's not going to work. I've put a little effort into the wiki on GitHub. My documentation skills are not that great, so but take a look, see what you like, see what you don't like. Definitely open issues. If you have any ideas of other things that you want to add as options. A few people in the community have added options like the RAM was something I didn't even think about because I just do quick, dirty testing. But somebody wanted to be able to say, no, I want like 16 gigs of RAM. So they added things like that. So testing, we're getting to what Alistair just talked about. Packer is a system for creating identical machine images for multiple platforms. And that basically kind of boils down to Linux. But they're getting better support for Windows, and they have added support for OS X as well. It is from the same company that makes Vagrant, so the two kind of go hand in hand. There's a few ways that we can use Packer with OS X. I think the best way is to use our friend Tim's OS X VM templates, which uses Packer's VMware ISO provider to build and prepare a VM for Vagrant. So you essentially just pass it your OS X installer app to the script, and it does that. There's a little bit of setup that you have to do with this process. You run the prepare ISO shell script that's in Tim's GitHub repo. And what that does is it prepares the OS X installer, saves it out as an ISO file. It's slipstreaming some scripts and installers into the OS X installer so that when the system loads, it'll configure the Vagrant user, set the SSH settings, and everything that Packer needs to then log in and configure it the way it wants to do it. When it's done, you get a DMG ISO, basically. And then you run Packer against that DMG ISO. You get the MD5 checksum up there. So you pass the checksum and the path to your ISO. And what's really great is Tim's built-in support for VirtualBox and Parallels as well. I don't use those two. What?
I didn't do it.
He agreed to merge pull requests that added VirtualBox and Parallel support, which assumedly works.
They all seem to work out.
Okay.
VirtualBox, you can actually.
The word is that they work on even future releases of OS X. And I've seen Tim post screenshots where he's had all three running at once. It's pretty fantastic. Oops. The downside is it takes a long time. So it's running the OS X installer. It's doing some prep work. Packer's doing its thing. And then, as the name Packer implies, it's compressing the disks down. And that part can take a good 20 or 30 minutes, even on an SSD. So it's a great time to get coffee. Call your mom, for God's sake. When it's done, you can use the vagrant box add command to pull that vagrant box into your local vagrant repo that they store on in your local home directory. And that uses the VMware ISO provider, but the Packer documentation also made reference to a VMware VMX provider, which did not work in a version of Packer previous to 0.7.2 or something. But that was patched and works with OS X VMs now. So that got me to thinking, well, we already have a way to build images. We have a way to convert it to a VM as a never booted VM. What if we could use that VM as a way to be the source for our Vagrant box? So I came up with a Vagrant integration with the whole vfuse business. The idea here is it's using the Vagrant VMX provider rather than the ISO provider. So instead of using the OS X installer as its source, it's using a VMX file, a VMDK basically. It requires some preparation as well. The base image you create with AutoDMG, you need to add the Vagrant user, and they assume that the password is going to be Vagrant. You can change that, but then you have to go change it in other places. And I just use it for quick and dirty testing. These are not production VMs by any means. You need a package to suppress the setup assistant, and some method of running some bootstrapping scripts. And I use a separate project that I have up in GitHub called Outset that is a launch daemon that can just run, it just iterates through a folder of scripts. And so you can throw things in there like, turning off sleep, making sure the screensaver doesn't come on over the login window, which kills VMs, things like that. And this is the repo I made for just the quick, for this demo, the quick and dirty setup scripts that I set for my Vagrant box creation. Excuse me. It sets the host name, ensures the network adapters are there. I think that's another thing I got from Tim. Sets the power controls and all that good stuff. So you can take your resulting image, that you get and process it with a vfuse template and have it also process a Packer template JSON file, which he was really interested in like 5 seconds ago. With the stock Packer template that I have up in my vfuse GitHub repo, it has pretty much everything you need to run with everything I have up there. And all that the script will do is change the path to the VMX file. So you don't have to go in there and manually copy and paste to where it saved your VMX to. So now, when you run vfuse against this template, it'll create the VMDK and the VMX file as usual. And it also updates the Packer template JSON file as well. And at that point, you can pass that to Packer. And I'm not doing anything fancy with checksumming like we were before. And it will clone that system, clone the VM, load it, Packer logs in, does everything you want it to do. By default, I have it. It's doing, I cloned or forked Tim's script, so it's installing Puppet and Chef and running a few other things. It still takes a long time. It doesn't have to run through the whole OS X installation routine, but it's still doing that compression of the resulting disk, which, like I said, takes quite a long time. Of course, by now, Mom's probably expecting another call. And since it's using the VMware VMX builder, it's cloning the system. But Packer knows, Packer is smart enough to clean up after itself. So it's not going to leave a clone of your entire VM sitting there as a 14 gigabyte breadcrumb. And then that leads to some really fun stuff that you can do with Vagrant. Who here has played around with Vagrant? Who's done Vagrant with OS X as a guest? Vagrant's a tool for developers to quickly spin up test environments. Most of the use cases are around Linux, obviously. You could use it to spin up a whole, networking stack and do some testing, whatever those crazy developers do. But we can get it to work with OS X boxes as well. The Vagrant commands are pretty simple. There's a list you can get with Vagrant list. I believe it's Vagrant list. But the ones I find myself using all the time are init, up, halt, destroy, reload. Init, when run in an empty folder, we'll just create a generic Vagrant file. If you give it a box name, it will either go search HashiCorp's cloud repository for that machine and download it, or it'll look in your local Vagrant and configure the Vagrant file for that specific machine. Vagrant up brings the system up. It's cloning from the local cache into your local directory inside a bunch of hidden folders. And then you see the output. You'll see a bunch of stuff about network, and then eventually it'll either say it succeeded or failed. And at that point, status will give you, it's up, it's down, there is one, but it's not running. There's nothing running. You haven't initiated it yet, that sort of thing. You can run Vagrant SSH, and Vagrant will log itself in to your VM. and give you a shell prompt in your terminal right there. If you pass a command with -C, it'll run that command on the system and give you the output locally. Vagrant reload does a graceful restart. If the VMware tools are not installed or it has any failure, it will kill the VM as well if it can't do a graceful restart. Halt will just bring it down. And destroy, obviously, will bring it down, delete your local cache, but it's not deleting the original that's in the vagrant folder, which is in your home directory under .vagrant. So if you do a vagrant destroy, you lose all your work, but you do a vagrant up, you have a new vanilla system based on that same VM. So what are some fun examples that you can do with Vagrant and OS X? Well, I know that, like all of you here, I do a lot of testing with OS X beta seeds, but downloading the seeds every time can be kind of a cumbersome task, especially if you don't have a dedicated machine and you don't feel like installing the seed configuration utility on your own machine, which some people do. So I created a Vagrant file that does this for me. Basically what it does is, here's the Vagrant file. What it does is it specifies the Vagrant box to use, and I'm just using a 10.10.3 box. Configures the sync folder, so it allows you to copy data between your host and the VM guest. Provisions some installer files. In this case, I have it copying the seed configuration utility onto the VM itself, and then runs a script which installs the seed configuration utility, does a software update call to Apple, and then figures out what the beta line is and copies that to a text file, and then downloads the beta package, sticks it in the sync folder so that you can get it from your host system. So you never even have to log into the VM. This is the beginning of the script that processes that checking and download of the seed. It's a quick and dirty Python script. This is what it looks like in action. Vagrant gives you really good output. Green is good. Red, not so great. And one thing that's great about it is it gives you standard out. So if you have a script that is returning information, you're not losing that because it's running within the VM. Vagrant receives that information. And after 10 minutes or so, depending on your network connection, you have a brand new seed update package that you can throw into your testing repo for whatever distribution method that you're using. Another example that I use Vagrant for is to test Imager, or iMagR, as I like to call it. Imager is a new NetBoot system that is useful for people like myself who don't need the large amount of options that Deploy Studio provides, and would prefer not to have OS X involved in that process at all. So I have a Vagrant file that specifies the Vagrant box to use. In this case, it's a Ubuntu system because it runs in Linux. Configures that sync folder. And the sync folder is where my NVI is. Provisions some installer files into the system. Passes a shell script as a provisioner. And when the system loads up, It runs through the shell script, which then does all the creation of the Docker containers to run Imager and configure the shared directories, the HTTP, and everything that you need. When that's all done, you can start up a blank VM in Fusion just by going to Start New, and then say Customize, go through, make sure you're using auto detect for the network, start it up, and you can netboot from the VM running on your own system. So it's a great way to do testing for this netboot system that our friend Graham Gilbert is putting together over in the UK. Everybody bow down before Graham. This is an interesting one. OS query, and I hope I'm not jumping your gun here, but it's a fascinating suite of security tools coming out of Facebook. And I wanted to dip my toes in and see what it was all about, but again, I don't like to install things on my own system. I don't really feel like grabbing a laptop out of the desk, setting it up, installing something. So I created a Vagrantfile that is very simple. It just configures that sync folder again, provisions an installer file, and that installer file runs when Vagrant brings the box up, installs OS query for me. So then when it's all done, I can log in and interact with it in any way that I see fit. This is the part where it's running the provisioning. And in this example, instead of running Vagrant up, I already had a VM loaded. So I just ran Vagrant provision, and it'll look through the Vagrant file at any provisioners that you have and rerun them. So you can SSH in, do some playing around with OS query, and this was all set up from a scratch system without having to install anything. It just did it all for me. And finally, I do my Casper JSS policy testing through a Vagrant file. Still a pretty simple Vagrant file, just a few more steps. It passes a shell script to the provisioner, reorders the network devices because I want the public address to be above the private address, installs my quick add package, and then runs a test bootstrap policy. And again, it gives you all the output from everything that it runs. When it's done, because I also, I'm going to go back a second, because I also have it set to boot to the GUI. By default, Vagrant runs headless, but you can add something to your Vagrant file or take a generic Vagrant file and comment out a few lines, and it'll allow the machine to start in the GUI. Because I have it doing that, I can then log in and try it out. And I was going to show one quick thing, but it seems like we are out of time. Any questions? And I'm done.
Thank you.